Imagine landing a life-changing bonus, only to give every cent away before anyone notices. Now picture the CEO of a billion-dollar trucking empire hunting down the driver who did it, but not for the reason you think. Stay with us, because this road leads to a lesson money can't buy. The interstate shimmered beneath the late summer sun, each mile ticking by like a metronome in the cab of truck 4182. Behind the wheel sat Edward Murphy, a man built by the road, mid-50s, calloused hands, and a calm stare sharpened by decades of asphalt and solitude. He didn't talk much, but when he did, his words landed like anchors. To most, Edward was just another seasoned driver in the fleet. But in truth, he was one of the company's most reliable. Not a single incident, late delivery, or customer complaint in over 6 years. That kind of consistency didn't go unnoticed. What did go unnoticed, at least at first, was that Edward had just been awarded the company's quarterly safety bonus. A clean, no-strings-attached $10,000 for keeping his rig and record spotless. No stage presentation, no HR photo op. Just a quiet email and a digital deposit. Edward barely glanced at it. His life was not easy. He lived on the road, carrying loads, sometimes in dangerous environments, and sometimes racing against time to complete deliveries. The bills at the end of the month were always tight, but he knew he had lived through worse times, and that working like this, something bigger would happen. "What you deserve always comes to you," he used to say. Without hesitation, he immediately thought of someone who would need the money more than he did. Marcus Ramirez was newer to the company, younger by 15 years, but the miles he carried weren't measured in freight. A former Marine, Marcus walked with a limp that no one asked about and smiled with the kind of gratitude that always felt borrowed. He was sharp, courteous, and always early for his shifts, but the bags under his eyes told a heavier story. Edward had noticed him outside the showers one morning, trying to keep a phone call quiet. Insurance jargon, copays, the word amputation whispered like a curse. That was all Edward needed to hear. No grand speech, no pity. 3 days later, Marcus received a cashier's check, anonymous but unmistakable, slipped under the door of his motel room at a truck stop just outside Springfield, Missouri. No note, no instructions, just the weight of a miracle he hadn't dared pray for. Marcus stood frozen, his breakfast untouched on the dresser. He reread the amount 5 times, fingers trembling. $10,000. Enough to cover the backlogged hospital bills and buy his daughter the specialized braces she'd been waiting for. He searched the parking lot like someone waiting for a ghost. He wouldn't find Edward. He was already 2 states away, sipping black coffee in a greasy diner and ignoring the notification on his phone that the funds had been received. Back at the depot, the silence around the bonus was strange. Normally, safety winners were mentioned in the monthly bulletin, handed a plaque or at least a handshake. But this time, nothing. Edward hadn't told a soul. Not his dispatcher, not his friends, not even his sister in Idaho, who kept asking if he was finally saving some money for retirement. The money never came to him. At a truck stop outside Little Rock, Edward crossed paths with Marcus again. They both reached for the same thermos brand at the supply shop and laughed. The conversation was short, but something about Marcus's eyes had changed. Less weight, more clarity. As they stood in the checkout line, Marcus shared that a guardian angel had given him a second chance. And though he didn't know who it was, he promised to pay it forward if he ever got the chance. Edward just nodded. That night, Marcus sat in his cab and called his daughter. Told her the surgery was paid for. Told her to start dreaming again. Edward sat in his own truck, listening to the hum of the highway, wondering how something so small could feel so necessary. But acts of kindness, no matter how quiet, leave footprints. What Edward didn't know was that his bonus had triggered a flag in the accounting system. A system not used to bonuses vanishing off the books without a matching tax form or spending record. A low-level analyst noticed the irregularity, and a routine report was about to reach a set of eyes far removed from the diesel-stained world Edward lived in. A chain reaction had begun, not of scandal but of curiosity. Edward wasn't chasing recognition, but recognition was about to chase him. The whine of pressure hoses and the scent of diesel filled the air as drivers lined up at the fuel island outside the company's St. Louis logistics hub. The usual chatter floated around: bad traffic on I-44, a busted reefer unit, someone's third divorce. But on that muggy Thursday morning, the tone was different. Louder, more curious. "Did you hear about the bonus?" Started small. A driver named Tanner, known for his big belt buckle and bigger opinions, leaned over the pump to Calvin, sipping his coffee out of a faded army mug. "Edward Murphy. Word is he gave away his 10 grand. Just didn't cash it." Calvin squinted. "Why would someone walk away from that kind of money?" "Hell, I'd fight a bear for 10 grand. Tanner shrugged. "That's what I'm saying. Someone's lying, or there's a story." In truth, the story had already begun to unravel. 2 floors up, inside the depot's admin office, where a young accountant named Layla Norton had flagged a discrepancy in the employee bonus log. Edward's name was on the winner list, but the usual tax documentation hadn't been filed. His direct deposit had been canceled, and a cashier's check, issued manually by someone in payroll, was marked as fulfilled externally. That phrase didn't sit right with Layla. Nothing in this place was ever fulfilled externally without 5 layers of signatures. She fired off a polite but pointed email to the regional operations manager, Derek Halston, attaching the documentation and adding a short note: "Unusual bonus transaction. May require follow-up." Derek, a man who treated his clipboard like a Bible and considered protocol a sacred language, read the message 3 times before taking action. The timing was convenient. He was already on edge after hearing that Marcus Ramirez, a relatively new hire, had suddenly paid off several months of overdue health costs and submitted receipts for reimbursable travel he'd previously let slide. Coincidence? Maybe. But in a company this big, coincidences were often warning signs or, worse, opportunities. By that afternoon, Derek was standing at the end of the driver lounge, arms crossed, watching Edward refill his thermos. Edward's usual calm didn't flinch under the scrutiny, but he noticed the sidelong glances. The change in temperature. "You hear what they're saying about you?" asked Mel, an older driver who'd run convoys in Afghanistan before switching to freight. "That you're either a fool or a saint." "I ain't either," Edward replied without looking up. Mel smiled. "That's what a saint would say." Across the lot, Marcus was beginning to feel the weight of gratitude become something else: attention. A few co-workers congratulated him vaguely, others avoided eye contact. Someone asked him outright if he won the lottery or had a rich uncle finally die. He laughed it off, but the tension in his shoulders never left. Inside the corporate headquarters in Chicago, however, the whispers took a very different form. A sleek, glass tower with panoramic views of the lake. The HQ might as well have existed on a different planet from the depots it managed. But the numbers always traveled. And one number had caught the eye of the woman at the top. Victoria Sterling, CEO of Sterling Freight and Logistics, sat alone in her office with a stylus in hand and a massive touchscreen lit up with live stats, routes, driver retention, fuel consumption, customer feedback. She wasn't just a figurehead. She was a numbers empath, with an uncanny ability to see the story behind every percentage point. So when the flagged bonus line, $10,000, disbursed but not claimed, crossed her dashboard, she tapped it. She read Layla's email, paused. Then she asked her executive assistant, "Pull me everything we have on an Edward Murphy. No alerts, just a quiet file pull. I want to know who gives away 10 grand without blinking." They knew that the situation for drivers was sometimes difficult, and that this was not a very normal act for someone who had finally received a bonus. This wasn't her first time investigating something small that turned out to be massive. Victoria had built her reputation on chasing anomalies, finding the people who made decisions that algorithms couldn't predict, and either promoting them or learning from them. Edward's file was thin but clean. Decades in the business. Perfect safety record. No HR complaints. Average fuel efficiency, above average route completion time. Notes from previous managers called him reliable, stoic, and not ambitious. And yet, here he was, potentially the source of a gesture that had sent quiet ripples across the company's lower ranks. Victoria's interest wasn't just philosophical. She'd spent years fighting a war inside her own boardroom, a war over culture. How to scale humanity within a billion-dollar operation. How to incentivize empathy in an industry measured by delivery windows and operating ratios. She saw something in this story, if it was true, that proved her point. She decided it was time to leave the tower. Back in St. Louis, Derek's investigation stalled. Edward refused to confirm or deny anything. Marcus swore he didn't know who sent the money. And no one in payroll had seen the cashier's check after it was printed. The trail went cold. But the air was charged. Every mechanic, dispatcher, and Fuel Island regular knew something had happened. They just didn't know what or why it mattered so much to the folks upstairs. Edward continued to work his routes in silence. He didn't mind being ignored. But being watched? That was new. And the most powerful woman in the company was already boarding a red-eye flight with one thing on her mind. Some debts aren't owed in dollars. She intended to find the man who understood that better than most. The storm rolled in fast. Sheets of rain lashed the windshield of truck number 4182, its wipers struggling to keep up with the torrential downpour sweeping across the Ozarks. Inside the cab, Edward Murphy leaned forward, eyes sharp, hands steady on the wheel as his 18-wheeler carved its way through the winding, flooded highways. His headlights cut through the storm like twin swords, but visibility was near zero. The cargo he carried, a specialized medical unit needed before sunrise in Memphis, was sensitive, fragile, and not the kind of freight you could afford to delay. His GPS rerouted twice due to flooding. The clock was ticking, but Edward didn't flinch. For him, driving through storms was nothing new. What was new, however, was what waited on the other end of this journey, though he didn't know it yet. 300 miles north, the skies were clear, but the atmosphere inside the St. Louis logistics hub was anything but. Word had spread like wildfire. Victoria Sterling, the enigmatic CEO of Sterling Freight and Logistics, had landed in Missouri, without warning, without handlers, without a PR team. She walked into the depot that morning in dark jeans, boots, and a raincoat, carrying nothing but a leather-bound tablet and a quiet intensity that made seasoned managers sweat. Derek Halston, the regional manager, scrambled to meet her at the entrance. "Miss Sterling, what an honor, I wasn't informed you." "I know," she cut in gently. "That's the point." She walked past him, scanning the depot like a field commander inspecting the front line. Forklifts buzzed, dispatchers whispered, and drivers suddenly remembered to tuck in their shirts. Victoria's presence was electric, calm but commanding, the kind that didn't need to raise a voice to silence a room. She spent the morning interviewing staff, not from behind a desk but on the ground, in break rooms beside trucks along the fuel lines. She asked simple questions. Who do you trust around here? Who works quietly? Who do people go to when they're in trouble? One name kept surfacing. Not shouted, but offered like a secret. Edward Murphy. "He doesn't talk much," said Mel. "But he listens like it's his job. He fixed my rig off the clock once. Refused to take a dime," said another driver. Victoria made a note. She was piecing together a puzzle, and though the corners weren't yet clear, the image forming at its center was unmistakable. Back on the highway, Edward gripped the wheel tighter as his rig hydroplaned for a split second near a washed-out bridge. He pulled over, took a breath, checked his axles. He could have stopped. No one would have blamed him. But he didn't. He wasn't just hauling medical gear. He was hauling his word. To him, a delivery wasn't just a job. It was a promise. Lightning cracked across the sky as he pushed on, inching toward Memphis. At the depot, Victoria found herself in the dispatch room, staring at Edward's live route on the screen. The system flagged his location, off course due to road closures. ETA recalculated. "Why wasn't this load reassigned?" she asked. Derek cleared his throat. He refused, said he'd handle it himself. "We trust him." Victoria studied the red line snaking through the map. Then, almost to herself, "He trusts something more." As night fell, she sat in the driver lounge, watching the rain blur the windows, sipping coffee from a paper cup. Her assistant had offered to book a hotel. She declined. She wanted to be here when Edward returned, not as a CEO, but as someone who needed to understand what kind of man would give up $10,000 in silence and still show up the next day like it meant nothing. At 4:18 a.m., headlights pierced the depot lot. Truck number 4182 coasted in slow, tires hissing against wet concrete. Edward stepped out, soaked to the bone, clipboard in hand. He didn't look up until he heard a voice behind him. "You made it." He turned. Victoria stood a few feet away, raincoat over her shoulders, her expression unreadable. Edward gave a simple nod. "Wasn't much of a choice." "I think there was," she said. "You just made the right one." There was a long pause. Two very different people standing in the hush before sunrise, surrounded by humming trucks and the scent of diesel. Victoria stepped closer. "You gave your bonus to Marcus." Edward didn't answer. "I'm not asking to congratulate you. I'm asking because I need to know why." He looked away, then met her gaze. "Because someone had to, and I could." That was it. No speech, no sermon. And it was enough. Victoria nodded slowly. "Do you know how rare it is for someone to do the right thing when no one's watching?" Edward shrugged. "No more rare than needing help and being too proud to ask." Another pause. Then she smiled. "You're not just a good driver, Edward. You're the kind of person this company was built to serve, and the kind we should be following." He blinked. "I just deliver freight, ma'am." She looked around the depot, then back at him. "Not anymore." That morning, as the sun broke over the parking lot, something shifted, not just for Edward, but for everyone who had watched the rumors unfold. Victoria had seen 1,000 spreadsheets, but it was skid marks in a storm and a silent act of generosity that taught her the truth. Culture isn't written in manuals. It's carried by people, one quiet mile at a time, and she was about to put that belief into motion. The sun hadn't quite cleared the horizon when the service bay lights flickered on. Pale beams spilled across rows of tools, engine hoists, and the silhouettes of two men standing shoulder to shoulder in silence. Edward Murphy, still in his damp work jacket from the night's run, leaned against a toolbox. Beside him, Marcus Ramirez, wearing a faded Marine Corps hoodie, shifted nervously. His arm was in a brace again, post-op pain flaring from the bone graft, but his eyes were clear for the first time in weeks. Across from them stood Victoria Sterling, the woman who ran the company whose name was stitched across their uniforms. But in this moment, there was no podium, no boardroom polish. She stood with her sleeves rolled, boots slightly muddy, her eyes fixed not on two employees, but two men who'd changed her entire perception of leadership. Edward broke the silence first. "You didn't have to come down here." "No," Victoria replied. "But I needed to." She set a manila folder on the workbench. "This is your new contract, Edward. VP of Fleet Culture and Driver Operations. Custom built. Your hours. Your terms. You'd oversee mentoring, training, wellness initiatives, driver-first stuff. And you'd still get road time if you want it." Edward blinked. "VP?" Marcus let out a soft whistle. "Man, they're handing out titles now?" Victoria smiled. "No, just recognizing the ones already earned." She turned to Marcus next, holding up another envelope. "And for you, our match donation. 10,000. Tax cleared, direct to your hospital account. You're fully covered." Marcus froze, jaw tightening. "Ma'am, I didn't ask for—" "You didn't have to," she interrupted. "You served your country. Then you served this company. You don't need to ask for dignity." His voice cracked. "I don't know what to say." "Good," Victoria said gently. "Then just keep driving. That's enough." Outside, drivers were gathering for their morning checks. The usual rhythm of pre-trip inspections, engine roars, and shouted jokes floated across the yard. But word had spread. Something big was happening in Bay 3. Inside, the air shifted. The decision now sat squarely on Edward's shoulders. He looked at the folder, the title, the opportunity, and then at his calloused hands. "I've spent most of my life with diesel in my blood," he said. I know every county line from Maine to New Mexico. The roads where I feel honest. Simple. Victoria nodded. I understand. But, he continued, looking at Marcus, if one quiet decision can ripple through a whole fleet, maybe it's time I taught others how to make them too. Victoria's smile widened. Then say yes. Edward exhaled. All right, but I still want to haul 2 runs a month. Done, she said. And one more thing. She pulled out her tablet and tapped into the company dashboard. Effective immediately, we're rolling out a new initiative, the Murphy Standard. Every quarter, we'll highlight one act of character, selflessness, or courage from our fleet. Not for PR, not for bonuses, just to remind people what this company's made of. You set the first one. Edward rubbed the back of his neck, clearly overwhelmed. That's more than I expected. It's less than you deserve. That afternoon, the ripple began. Drivers across the Midwest opened their apps to find an alert. New driver rep, Edward Murphy. It came with a short video, Victoria standing beside Edward in the service bay, explaining the new initiative and what had sparked it. Comments flooded in. He gave up 10 grand for another driver? Damn. I worked with Edward in Oregon once. Guy patched my flat in a snowstorm. About time someone from the road had a seat at the table. Marcus, meanwhile, finally sat down with the hospital finance office. Not as a debtor, but as a man whose burden had been halved overnight. He sent Edward a photo of the cleared invoice, scribbled a message on the back. You didn't save me, brother. You reminded me I was worth saving. And Victoria? She returned to her glass tower in New York, but with grease still under her nails and a deeper fire in her gut. She'd built her empire with spreadsheets. But it took 2 drivers, 1 gift, and a storm-chased delivery to remind her that wealth wasn't built in silence. It was driven forward, one selfless mile at a time. This journey reminds us that real wealth is measured in the lives we lift, not the zeros we earn. If you were in Edward's seat, would you bank the bonus or fuel someone else's hope? Drop your thoughts below, and if this ride moved you, hit like, share the story, and subscribe to embrace the journey for more roads worth traveling. See you in the next video.